An unexpected landing on a drought-stricken field, one farming family's surprising connection to the military officer who could determine if their town survives or dissolves. A desperate community's future hinging on a chance rescue during the worst storm in decades. This is the extraordinary story of how Jackson Foster's courage and resourcefulness changed not only his family's destiny, but saved an entire farming community from disappearing forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The antique tractor sputtered reluctantly to life at 4:45. Though Jackson Foster had already been up since 3, studying weather patterns on his laptop. At 32, the third-generation farmer's weathered face told a story of struggle beyond his years. 4 consecutive seasons of devastating drought had left Clearwater Valley's once thriving agricultural community hanging by a thread. The Foster family farm, with its 180 acres of once fertile land stretching toward the distant mountains, had been the cornerstone of Clearwater Valley since 1947. Now, with water restrictions tightening, fuel costs skyrocketing, and the nearby Westridge military base's impending closure announcement, their community faced extinction from multiple fronts. Jackson pulled his worn cap lower against the pre-dawn chill and climbed down from the tractor. The irrigation system he'd been desperately trying to salvage was failing again. 4 years of patching and improvising could only stretch resources so far. Inside the farmhouse, his father David sat at the kitchen table, the harsh light from his tablet illuminating his lined face as he reviewed their latest bank statement. The bold red numbers told a story neither wanted to discuss again. "Any luck with the North Field pump?" David asked without looking up. "Bearings are shot," Jackson replied, pouring himself coffee from the pot that had been brewing since his father woke up. "I can machine a replacement part, but it's just buying time. The whole system needs an overhaul we can't afford." The kitchen where this conversation took place had once been the vibrant heart of the Foster home. Photographs on the wall chronicled happier times. Jackson's grandfather, standing proudly beside the first tractor they'd purchased in 1950, his parents' beaming faces during the record harvest of 1997, a young Jackson holding a blue ribbon from the county fair for his prize-winning irrigation design. David finally looked up from the screen, pushing it away, as if physically rejecting the financial reality it represented. "Senator Thompson's office called back yesterday. They're still reviewing options regarding the base closure." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd heard empty promises before. Westridge Military Base had been Clearwater Valley's economic lifeline for generations. Beyond providing direct employment, the military personnel had populated the town's schools, supported local businesses, and brought federal funding for infrastructure that benefited everyone. The Department of Defense's announcement 6 months ago that Westridge was on the closure list had sent shockwaves through the community. "Political speak for don't count on us," Jackson said, taking a seat across from his father. "What about the water rights petition?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. David shook his head. "Regional Water Authority says the emergency reallocation is going to the corporate farms downstream. Apparently, their economic impact justifies priority status." Jackson's jaw tightened. The corporate agricultural operations that had moved into the valley 15 years ago had systematically acquired water rights, effectively strangling smaller family farms during the prolonged drought. Their massive irrigation systems pulled from the deepening wells that individual farmers couldn't afford to drill. "I've been working on an adapted drip system," Jackson offered, "using recycled materials and the design I've been testing on the southeast field. With some modifications, we might reduce water usage by another 15% while maintaining yield." David's eyes softened with pride despite their dire situation. His son's innovative approach to farming had kept them afloat longer than many of their neighbors. Jackson had an engineer's mind, always designing, adapting, and solving problems with whatever materials were available. "Your grandfather would have called that Foster ingenuity," David said, a rare smile briefly lighting his face. "He always said the land might challenge us, but it's our creativity that sustains us." Jackson nodded, having heard these words throughout his childhood. His grandfather had purchased this land when experts warned about its rocky sections. His father had expanded during the farm crisis of the 1980s, when others fled agriculture. The Fosters had always been adaptable, resilient, forward thinkers. But this combination of drought, economic pressure, and the base closure presented challenges beyond anything they'd faced before. As dawn painted the eastern sky with reluctant light, Jackson walked to the window, looking out over their struggling fields. From this vantage point, he could see the stark contrast between the Foster farm and the emerald rectangles of Agricor Industries' corporate operation to the south. Their industrial irrigation systems created a jarring boundary between thriving crops and the increasingly desperate struggle of family farms. "Henderson's place sold yesterday," David said quietly, joining his son at the window. "Agricor's 11th acquisition this year." The Henderson farm had been in operation since before the Fosters arrived in Clearwater Valley. 5 generations of agricultural knowledge, erased by a signature on corporate letterhead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Tom said they're moving to his daughter's place in Oregon," David added. "Marjorie's heartbroken about leaving the house her grandfather built." The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of a vehicle outside. Through the window, they saw a sleek black SUV with government plates pulling up the driveway, kicking up dust that had once been fertile soil. "Looks like we have a visitor," David said, recognizing the Agricor logo on the woman's portfolio as she stepped out of the vehicle. "Ms. Carlson again," Jackson muttered. "Third visit this month." Rebecca Carlson, Agricor's acquisition manager, had become a regular presence in Clearwater Valley, systematically approaching struggling farmers with offers that grew more insistent with each visit. Her corporate smile and practiced sympathy barely masked the predatory nature of her mission. "Mr. Foster," she greeted as David opened the door, "I was hoping we might continue our conversation about your property's future." David's expression remained neutral as he invited her in, decades of rural hospitality overriding his personal feelings about what she represented. Jackson remained standing as Rebecca took a seat at the kitchen table, spreading documents from her leather portfolio. "Agricor has revised our offer," she began without preamble. "In light of the base closure announcement and the Water Authority's latest allocation decisions, we feel this represents an extremely generous valuation of your property." Jackson glanced at the figure circled in bold on the top page. It was 25% higher than their last offer, which had already been substantial. Despite himself, he felt a moment of temptation. The amount would clear their debts, provide a comfortable cushion for his parents, and give him a fresh start somewhere else. As if reading his thoughts, Rebecca continued, "Additionally, we've included a consulting position for you, Mr. Foster," she said, looking directly at Jackson. "Our R&D department is quite impressed with your irrigation innovations. We believe your expertise could benefit our sustainability initiatives across multiple properties." Jackson felt his father's eyes on him, but kept his attention on Rebecca. "And what happens to the land, to the community?" Rebecca's practiced smile didn't waver. "Progress requires transition, Mr. Foster. Agricor would integrate your acreage into our Clearwater operation, implementing economies of scale that simply aren't possible for individual farmers. The economic benefits would flow directly to your shareholders, Jackson finished for her, while Clearwater Valley becomes another corporate farming outpost with half the local employment and none of the community connection. Rebecca's smile tightened slightly. I understand your emotional attachment to traditional farming methods. Many families share that sentiment before recognizing the inevitable shift in agricultural economics. With the military base closing, holding on to outdated models isn't just impractical, it's potentially devastating for your family's financial future. David cleared his throat. We appreciate your concern for our financial well-being, Ms. Carlson. We'll review your offer and respond accordingly. Recognizing the diplomatic dismissal, Rebecca gathered her documents. Please do, but keep in mind that with the base closure proceeding and water rights increasingly concentrated, this offer has an expiration date. Agricultural economics wait for no one, Mr. Foster. After she departed, father and son stood in silence for a long moment. That's enough to pay off the equipment loans and the mortgage, David finally said, with some left over for you to start fresh somewhere with actual rainfall. Jackson ran a hand through his hair in frustration and become another statistic in the corporate consolidation of American farming. Another family legacy erased for quarterly profits? It's not surrender to recognize when the landscape has changed beyond our ability to adapt, David countered, though his heart wasn't in the argument. They'd had variations of this conversation. For months, Jackson's response was interrupted by the weather alert chime on his phone. He checked the notification, his expression growing concerned. The storm system's accelerated, he said. Weather Service is now predicting it'll hit by early afternoon instead of tonight. We need to secure everything we can. The approaching storm had been tracking for days, unusual for the region, which had seen precious little precipitation during the drought years. Forecasters were predicting potential flash flooding in a cruel irony. After years of desperate need for water, they might receive too much too fast, causing damage rather than relief. I'll check the equipment shed, David said, grateful for the shift to practical matters. You secure that experimental irrigation system in the south field. As they moved to their tasks, the morning sky was already darkening to the west, the approaching storm front visible as an ominous line on the horizon. Jackson worked methodically to protect the irrigation prototype he'd been developing, the system that represented their best hope for stretching dwindling water resources just a little further. The wind was picking up as he finished, carrying the electric scent of approaching rain. Despite the danger the storm presented, Jackson couldn't help feeling a surge of anticipation at the prospect of actual rainfall. Their collection systems were prepared to capture every precious drop. He was securing the last of the sensitive equipment when the first heavy drops began to fall. Within minutes, the scattered droplets transformed into sheets of driving rain, reducing visibility to mere yards. Jackson hurried toward his truck, his clothes already soaked despite the short distance. The storm's intensity was stunning after so many dry months. Rain hammered against the truck's roof as Jackson navigated the dirt road connecting their fields. Lightning split the darkening sky, followed almost instantly by deafening thunder. This wasn't just the usual summer storm. This was something more significant. Through the blur of his windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour, Jackson noticed something unusual in the eastern field. At first, he thought it was debris carried by the strengthening wind. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the scene more clearly, and he slammed on his brakes. There, in the middle of their struggling wheat field, was the unmistakable silhouette of a small aircraft, nose down in the mud, its landing gear partially collapsed. "What the hell?" Jackson muttered, immediately changing direction. He drove as close as the muddy conditions allowed, then pulled on his rain gear and jumped out into the deluge. The plane was a military training aircraft, a T-6 Texan II based on its profile. The kind used at Westridge for pilot instruction. It had clearly made an emergency landing, skidding through the muddy field before coming to rest at an awkward angle. One wing was damaged, where it had clipped an irrigation pipe. But remarkably, the aircraft appeared largely intact. More importantly, Jackson could see movement in the cockpit. Someone was alive in there. He splashed through ankle-deep mud toward the aircraft, rain pelting his face despite his hood. As he approached, the canopy opened with obvious effort, and a figure in a flight suit struggled to extricate themselves from the cockpit. "Need a hand?" Jackson called out, fighting to be heard over the storm. The pilot looked up, relief visible even through the rain streaming down their face. "Never. Thought I'd be so happy to see a civilian," came the reply, the voice distinctly female, despite its authoritative tone. Jackson reached the aircraft and extended his hand to help the pilot down. She was tall, perhaps in her mid-40s, with short, grey-streaked hair plastered to her head by the rain. Despite the emergency landing and the storm, she carried herself with unmistakable military bearing. "Colonel Alexandra Hayes," she introduced herself once on solid ground, though solid was becoming a relative term as the field turned increasingly to mud. "United States Air Force, I apologize for dropping in on your property unannounced." "Jackson Foster," he replied, taking in the eagle insignia on her flight suit with surprise. This wasn't just any pilot. She was a full colonel. "Let's get you somewhere dry. Can you walk?" The colonel tested her weight on both legs, wincing slightly. "Nothing's broken, but my ankle's not happy. The landing was sportier than I would have preferred." Lightning cracked directly overhead, making both of them flinch. "Explanations can wait," Jackson shouted over the storm. "My truck's just over there." He helped Colonel Hayes limp through the mud toward his vehicle, noticing that despite her composed exterior, she was favoring her right leg significantly. Once they reached the truck, he helped her into the passenger seat before hurrying around to the driver's side. "Thank you," she said as he started the engine and cranked the heater. "That could have gone significantly worse without your timely arrival." "What happened up there?" Jackson asked, navigating carefully through the increasingly treacherous conditions. The rain was coming down so hard now that even at crawling speed, the wipers couldn't keep up. "Engine failure during a routine flight," Hayes explained, professionally detached despite her circumstances. "The storm front moved faster than forecasted, and I lost power at the worst possible moment, with visibility compromised and insufficient. Altitude to reach the base, I had to make an emergency landing decision." "You picked a good field," Jackson commented. "Soft enough from the rain to cushion your landing, but solid enough not to flip the aircraft." Hayes looked at him with new interest. "You know something about aviation?" "Served as a mechanic in the Army before taking over the family farm," Jackson explained. "Worked on helicopters mostly, but the principles aren't that different. Plus, growing up next to Westridge, you learn a thing or two about aircraft." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "Well, your field may have saved my life, Mr. Foster. I'll ensure the Air Force compensates you for any damage." Jackson couldn't help but laugh, the sound lacking humor. "Trust me, Colonel, whatever the Air Force might pay for crop damage is the least of my concerns right now." He drove them toward the farmhouse, where the lights were now on despite it being mid-afternoon. The storm had turned day to artificial night. As they pulled up, David Foster came out onto the porch, his expression changing from concern to confusion at the sight of a uniformed Air Force officer in his son's truck. Dad," Jackson called as they hurried through the rain to the porch, supporting the limping colonel. "This is Colonel Hayes. Her plane made an emergency landing in the East Field. Colonel, my father, David Foster." David's eyebrows shot up, but rural hospitality kicked in immediately. "Let's get you inside and dried off, Colonel. Any injuries we should be concerned about?" "Just a twisted ankle, sir," Hayes replied respectfully. "Nothing some ice and elevation won't fix." Once inside, David disappeared to find dry clothes while Jackson helped the colonel to a chair, quickly assembling an improvised ice pack for her ankle. "I need to report my status," Hayes said, reaching for the phone on her belt, only to find it waterlogged and unresponsive. "Do you have a landline I could use? Cell service is likely compromised by the storm." "Landline's in the kitchen," Jackson directed her. "But I should warn you, service gets spotty during severe weather. We're at the end of the line out here." As Colonel Hayes limped to the kitchen to attempt her call, David returned with dry clothes, a flannel shirt and jeans that would be too large but better than a soaked flight suit. "These were my wife's," he explained, handing them to the colonel when she returned from an apparently unsuccessful phone attempt. "She was tall like you. You're welcome to change in the bathroom down the hall." "Thank you, Mr. Foster," Hayes said, accepting the clothes. "The lines appear to be down. I'll need to wait out the storm before reporting in or attempting to arrange transport." While the colonel changed, Jackson and his father spoke in hushed tones. A military aircraft making an emergency landing during this storm, David marveled. "What are the odds?" "At least no one was hurt," Jackson replied. "But her plane's going to need specialized recovery equipment. That field will be a muddy mess for days after this rain." "She's pretty high-ranking for a training flight," David observed. "Colonels usually don't fly the trainers at Westridge." Before Jackson could respond, Colonel Hayes returned, looking remarkably authoritative, despite wearing borrowed civilian clothes. The Foster men offered her coffee, which she gratefully accepted. "I apologize for the imposition," she said as they settled at the kitchen table, the storm raging outside. "Once communications are restored, I'll arrange for recovery personnel to handle the aircraft with minimal disruption to your property." "Don't worry about it," Jackson assured her. "We're just glad you're all right. It's not every day we get an Air Force colonel dropping in, literally." Hayes smiled slightly at the attempted humor, then her expression grew more serious as she noticed the AgriCorps documents still on the table where Rebecca Carlson had left them. Something in her posture changed subtly. "Foster Farm," she said thoughtfully. "You're the irrigation specialist, aren't you?" "The one developing drought-resistant farming techniques." Jackson looked surprised. "You've heard of our operation?" "I've been reviewing the economic impact reports for the region," Hayes replied carefully. "Your name has come up in discussions about innovative agricultural approaches. Those techniques could have broader applications." David leaned forward. "You're part of the base closure committee, aren't you?" Hayes hesitated before answering, clearly weighing her words. "I'm involved with the assessment process, yes, but I'm not at liberty to discuss the details." The atmosphere in the kitchen shifted perceptibly. What had seemed like a random emergency landing suddenly took on potential significance. If Colonel Hayes had influence in the base closure decision, her presence on their farm, seeing firsthand the challenges they faced, could be meaningful. "Well, since you're stuck here until the storm passes," Jackson said, making a quick decision, "would you be interested in learning more about those irrigation techniques? They might be relevant to your assessment." Hayes studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That would be appropriate, yes. The committee values comprehensive understanding of local economic factors." As the storm continued to batter the farmhouse, Jackson found himself explaining his irrigation innovations to one of the very military officials who might determine whether Westridge Base, and by extension, Clearwater Valley, survived. Sometimes, he reflected, opportunity arrived in the most unexpected packages, even in the form of a colonel with a damaged aircraft in the middle of a drought-breaking storm. The rain hammered against the windows with increasing intensity as Jackson spread his design sketches across the kitchen table. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the farmhouse's older windows. Weather alerts continued to chime on their phones, flash flood warnings for areas that had been desperate for water just hours before. The conventional approach to irrigation treats water as an abundant resource, Jackson explained, pointing to his diagrams. But in drought conditions, every drop matters. My system combines targeted delivery with soil moisture monitoring to reduce consumption by nearly 40% while maintaining yield. Colonel Hayes studied the designs with genuine interest, asking surprisingly technical questions that revealed a deeper understanding of resource management than Jackson had expected from a military pilot. "You're using recycled materials for most of this," she observed, tracing a finger along one of his hand-drawn schematics. "Repurposed PVC and modified commercial components," Jackson nodded. "When you can't afford proprietary systems, you innovate. Every piece is designed to be repairable with standard tools and locally available materials. Resourcefulness born of necessity," Hayes commented. "That's a principle the military understands well." David, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "Colonel, I understand you can't discuss the base closure directly, but surely you can see what's happening in this valley. Without Westridge, communities like ours won't just struggle, they'll disappear." Hayes looked up from the designs, her expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Foster, I appreciate your candor. The Department of Defense doesn't make base closure decisions lightly. Multiple factors are considered beyond local economic impact, strategic positioning, operational efficiency, budget constraints. And I'm sure those spreadsheets and efficiency reports tell a compelling story," Jackson said, with barely contained frustration. "But they don't show what happens to the people and the land when communities like Clearwater Valley collapse." The colonel's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, they don't. That's why first-hand assessment is valuable." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the house, and the lights flickered ominously before stabilizing. "Power grid's struggling," David observed, rising to check the emergency lanterns they kept ready during storm season. "Might be a long night." "Does your property have a generator?" Hayes asked. "For essential systems," Jackson confirmed. "We keep fuel reserves for emergencies, plus the solar array I installed last year provides backup for the well pump and critical equipment." "Forward thinking," Hayes noted. "Most operations I've assessed aren't nearly as prepared for contingencies." There was something in her tone that caught Jackson's attention. A hint that she might be more receptive to their situation than her official position allowed her to express directly. Before he could pursue that impression, his phone rang. Somehow, finding enough signal despite the storm. The screen showed Tom Wilson's name, their nearest neighbor and head of the local volunteer fire department. "Tom, what's happening?" Jackson answered, immediately concerned. His neighbor wouldn't call during a storm unless it was urgent. The connection was poor, Tom's voice breaking up between bursts of static. "Canyon Creek Dam. Overtopping. Evacuation. Western Farms." Jackson's blood ran cold. "The dam is failing, Tom. Tom!" The call dropped, leaving him staring at his phone in growing alarm. "What is it?" David asked, reading his son's expression. "Something about Canyon Creek Dam overtopping and evacuations," Jackson reported grimly. "If that small dam fails, every farm on the western side of the valley could be flooded." Hayes was immediately alert, her military training evident. "Do you have topographical maps of the area? We need to assess potential flood paths and vulnerable populations." David moved to a cabinet and pulled out detailed maps of Clearwater Valley, spreading them on the table where Hayes could see them. The colonel studied them intently, her finger tracing the waterways. "Canyon Creek Dam is here," Jackson indicated. "It's an older earth-filled dam that primarily serves as a livestock water reservoir, not designed for the kind of rainfall we're getting today." Hayes nodded, analyzing the map with practiced efficiency. "If it fails, water would follow this natural channel." She traced the path with her finger, "potentially threatening these properties within the first hour." The Wilson, Ramirez, and Johnson farms, David confirmed grimly. All family operations with homes close to the creek bed. Do they have evacuation plans? Hayes asked. Jackson shook his head. In a drought, flood evacuation hasn't exactly been top of mind. Most of these families have nowhere else to go anyway. Everything they have is tied to their land. Colonel Hayes straightened. Decision made. We need to establish an emergency response immediately. Do you have communication with these families? A radio network for emergencies, David confirmed, already moving toward the equipment in the corner. Not all will be monitoring in normal circumstances, but in a storm like this, most will have it on. While David attempted to reach their neighbors via radio, Jackson retrieved his laptop, pulling up weather radar and satellite imagery. The storm cell is stalling directly over the watershed feeding Canyon Creek, he reported. Another 3 to 4 hours of heavy precipitation at minimum. Hayes leaned over his shoulder, studying the radar. That dam won't hold that long if it's already overtopping. The community center in town is our designated emergency shelter, Jackson explained. Elevated position, generator backup, sufficient capacity for displaced residents. How far? Hayes asked. 12 miles by main road, but that crosses Canyon Creek twice, Jackson replied. If the bridges are compromised, there's the old forestry road, David interjected, returning from the radio. Contacted the Wilsons and Johnsons. They're preparing to evacuate. No answer from the Ramirez place. Jackson grabbed his rein. Gear. I need to check on them. Miguel's wife is expecting, and they have his elderly parents living with them. I'm coming with you, Hayes said decisively, already reaching for her borrowed jacket. My search and rescue certification might be needed. Your ankle, Jackson began to object, is functional enough, she cut him off. This is what I'm trained for, Mr. Foster. David looked between them, concern etched in his features. The truck has the winch if you get stuck. Take the emergency kit from the mudroom. Jackson nodded, grabbing additional supplies, while Hayes retrieved a compact tactical flashlight from a pocket of her flight suit. Within minutes, they were back. In his truck, fighting through rain so heavy, the wipers seemed almost useless. The Ramirez farm is 3 miles west, Jackson explained, as he navigated by memory more than visibility. They're closest to the dam, right in the potential flood path. Hayes was studying a satellite map on her phone, which, remarkably still, had enough cached data to function offline. Based on the topography, their farmhouse is on slightly elevated ground, but their access road runs alongside the creek. If the dam fails, they could be cut off, even if the house itself isn't immediately threatened. Jackson was impressed by her quick analysis. You seem to know a lot about flood dynamics for an Air Force officer. I served with the Air Force Civil Engineer Squadron before my current assignment, Hayes explained. Disaster response was part of our mission. The military trains us to be adaptable, Mr. Foster. Jackson, he corrected, fighting the steering wheel as they hydroplaned briefly. If we're going to risk our lives together, you might as well use my first name. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Alexandra, then. Though most people just call me Hayes. They drove in tense silence for another mile, the storm's ferocity seeming to increase with each passing minute. Suddenly, Jackson slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a sliding halt. God Almighty, he breathed. Before them, where the road should have continued, was a churning torrent of muddy water. Canyon Creek had already broken its banks, transforming from a nearly dry creek bed to a raging river that had washed out the road completely. The dam must have partially failed already, Hayes assessed grimly. Jackson reversed, turning the truck around. We need to try the back way through the Henderson property. It's higher ground. As they raced along an alternative route, Hayes used the truck's radio to attempt contact with emergency services, but static was the only response. They were on their own. The back way proved passable, but barely. a rutted farm track now transformed into a treacherous mudslick. Jackson's skilled driving kept them moving forward until finally the lights of the Ramirez farmhouse appeared through the gloom. Unlike many of the valley's farmhouses, the Ramirez home sat atop a small rise, a fortunate quirk of geography that might save it from immediate flooding. But water was already pooling at the bottom of their long driveway, threatening to cut off-road access entirely. Jackson honked repeatedly as they approached, and moments later the front door opened. Miguel Ramirez appeared, waving urgently for them to hurry. "The dam's failing!" Jackson shouted as soon as he was out of the truck. "You need to evacuate now." "Maria's contractions started an hour ago," Miguel replied, his face a mask of fear. "Too fast for a first baby. We tried calling the ambulance, but the lines are down." Hayes was immediately beside them. "I have emergency medical training. Let me check on her." Inside the farmhouse, they found Maria Ramirez on a couch, clearly in active labor. Miguel's parents were attempting to comfort her while gathering essentials into waterproof bags. Hayes knelt beside the young woman, speaking calmly as she assessed the situation. After a brief examination, she looked up at Jackson with a decisive expression. "She's too far along to move safely, especially over compromised roads. This baby is coming here, and soon." Miguel looked stricken. "But the flood?" "The house is on high ground," Jackson reassured him, though his own concern was evident. "But we need to prepare in case water reaches this level. Where are your tools? We need to reinforce the doors and lower windows." While Miguel and his father gathered tools, Jackson stepped outside to assess their position. The water at the bottom of the property was visibly rising, and the roar of Canyon Creek, normally a gentle trickle, was becoming alarmingly loud even over the continuing downpour. Making a quick decision, he drove his truck to the highest point on the property, positioning it for rapid evacuation if necessary. Then he began gathering cement blocks, sandbags, and plastic sheeting from the Ramirez's shed to create improvised flood barriers. Inside, Hayes had transformed from Air Force colonel to emergency midwife, calmly directing Miguel's mother in preparing clean towels and hot water while monitoring Maria's condition. "The baby's crowning," she announced when Jackson came in. "For more supplies. This is happening now. We need more light, the brightest lamps you can find." For the next 30 minutes, time seemed to exist in two separate realities. Inside the farmhouse, the timeless human drama of birth unfolded under Hayes's calm guidance. Outside, Jackson and the Ramirez men worked frantically to protect the house from the rising waters that were now covering half their property. Then, cutting through the storm's fury, came a new sound, the unmistakable cry of a newborn child. Jackson paused in his labor, sharing a moment of wonder with Miguel's father, despite their dire circumstances. Life, continuing in the face of destruction, held a powerful symmetry. The respite was brief. A sound like distant thunder, but more focused and sustained, reached them. Jackson's expression turned grim. "That's the dam giving way completely," he shouted. "We have minutes, not hours." He rushed inside to find Hayes wrapping the newborn. In clean blankets, Maria exhausted but radiant on the couch. The contrast between the peaceful domestic scene and the approaching danger was jarring. "We need to move." "Now," Jackson announced, "the main dam has failed. My truck is the only way out, and soon that won't be an option." Hayes immediately took command. "Miguel, help your wife. Mr. Ramirez, gather only essential medications and documents. Mrs. Ramirez, wrap the baby warmly and protect his head. We have less than 5 minutes." The urgency in her voice galvanized the family into action. Jackson gathered the most critical supplies, while Hayes helped Maria to her feet. Together, they made their way outside into the continuing downpour. The water had risen dramatically in just minutes, now lapping at the edge of the house's foundation. Jackson's truck, parked on the property's highest point, was their only hope for evacuation. "Get in the back," he directed the Ramirez family. "Hayes, you take the passenger seat. I'll need your eyes on the route." As they carefully helped Maria and the newborn into the truck's crew cab, a new sound cut through the storm, the distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors. "Military search and rescue," Hayes identified immediately, a flash of relief crossing her face. "Westridge must have launched emergency operations when they lost contact with me." A powerful spotlight cut through, the rain picking out their position. Jackson could make out the silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter descending as low as the dangerous conditions permitted. Hayes immediately pulled a small signal mirror from her flight suit pocket and used the truck's headlights to send a series of flashes, military communication that Jackson recognized from his own service days. "They can't land here," she shouted over the noise. "Too unstable with the flooding. They're directing us to evacuation coordinates." With the helicopter hovering overhead, its spotlight illuminating the safest path, Jackson navigated the truck. Through rising waters and around obstacles, the powerful aircraft kept pace above them, occasionally moving ahead to scout the route when fallen trees or flooded sections blocked their path. Through skill, determination, and the aerial guidance, they finally reached higher ground, where emergency vehicles waited. Medical personnel immediately took charge of Maria and her newborn, while other evacuees from neighboring farms gathered around, sharing stories of narrow escapes. As the storm continued to rage, Jackson found himself standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching as Hayes coordinated with the military personnel who had clearly been searching for her. Her authoritative presence had transformed the chaotic scene into an organized emergency response. "Your colonel's something else," David Foster commented, appearing at his son's side. He had evacuated to the emergency center earlier when the flooding began threatening their own property. "She's not my colonel," Jackson corrected automatically, then paused. "Wait, how did you get here?" "National Guard transport," David explained. "They've been evacuating the Eastern Valley farms for the past hour. Apparently, Colonel Hayes activated full emergency protocols when her aircraft went down." Jackson watched as Hayes directed both military and civilian emergency responders, her borrowed civilian clothes incongruous with the natural command she projected. "She said she was on the base closure committee," he mused. "I thought it was just luck that she landed on our property." David gave his son a knowing look. "Son, I've lived long enough to know that when a high-ranking military officer shows up exactly where and when they're needed most, it's rarely about luck." Before Jackson could process that cryptic statement, Hayes approached them, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite her unusual attire. "Mr. Foster, Jackson," she amended, "I need to speak with you about your farm and your irrigation system once this immediate crisis is contained." There was something in her tone, urgency mixed with purpose, that suggested this conversation would be about far more than crop damage from a crashed aircraft. Dawn broke over Clearwater Valley, with eerie stillness after the night's chaos. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape, fields turned to shallow lakes, roads rendered impassable, and debris scattered across once familiar terrain. The community center, now serving as an emergency shelter, buzzed with activity as displaced families huddled around tables with steaming coffee cups, exchanging stories of narrow escapes and uncertain futures. Jackson Foster stood by the large windows, surveying the damage visible from their elevated position. The valley basin, where generations of farmers had worked the soil, now resembled a vast, muddy lake, dotted with the partially submerged outbuildings and equipment no one had time to save. According to emergency services, nearly 60% of Clearwater Valley's agricultural land was currently underwater. "How's the Ramirez family?" David asked, joining his son at the window. Baby and mother are both stable, Jackson replied. They airlifted them to Westridge's medical facility an hour ago. Best equipped place, within 50 miles, with the main roads cut off. They stood in silence for a moment, processing the overnight transformation of their community. Our place? Jackson finally asked, though he already suspected the answer. North fields are flooded completely, David confirmed. The house is still above water, but the equipment shed took on about 2 feet. Your workshop too. Jackson nodded, absorbing this latest blow with the stoic resignation that farmers develop over years of battling unpredictable forces. What about your experimental irrigation system components? Managed to save the core electronic modules. Before evacuation, David patted his jacket pocket where he'd stored the thumb drives containing Jackson's designs. Everything else is replaceable. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. After years of desperate drought, they now faced destruction from too much water arriving too quickly. Mother Nature's cruel reminder that humanity's control over the elements was merely an illusion. Their conversation was interrupted by a purposeful presence approaching from behind. Colonel Alexandra Hayes, now back in a fresh military uniform, that someone had delivered from the base, moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. Despite having been awake all night coordinating rescue efforts, she appeared remarkably composed. Mr. Foster, she addressed David formally, then nodded to his son. Jackson, do you have a moment? Father and son exchanged glances before following. Hayes to a quieter corner of the community center where a makeshift command post had been established. Maps of Clearwater Valley were spread across tables marked with evacuation zones, resource deployments, and damage assessments. Military and civilian emergency personnel worked side by side, coordinating the valley's most significant disaster response in decades. The situation remains critical but stabilizing, Hayes informed them, pointing to the most recent satellite imagery of the valley. We've accounted for all residents, and preliminary engineering assessments indicate the flooding will begin receding within 36 to 48 hours, barring additional rainfall. What about Canyon Creek Dam? Jackson asked. Complete failure? Hayes nodded grimly. Catastrophic structural collapse. The spillways were inadequate for the water volume, and years of deferred maintenance left the primary structure vulnerable, nearly identical to 3 other small dams in the region. Maintenance costs money, David observed quietly. Most of these agricultural infrastructure projects have seen their budgets slashed repeatedly over the last decade. A false economy. Hayes agreed with surprising candor for a military officer. The recovery and reconstruction costs will far exceed what proper maintenance would have required. She gestured to a chair, inviting them to sit. However, I didn't ask to speak with you about the dam failure. There's another matter I'd like to discuss, one that may be significant for Clearwater Valley's future. Jackson noticed a shift in her demeanor. She was transitioning from emergency commander to something else, though her professional bearing remained unchanged. My presence in Clearwater Valley yesterday wasn't entirely coincidental, Hayes began, confirming David's earlier suspicion. I'm the Operational Assessment Director for the Military Installation Resilience Program, examining Westridge Air Base's long-term viability. You're the one who decides if Westridge closes, Jackson stated flatly. Not personally, no. The final decision involves multiple federal agencies and congressional approval, Hayes clarified. But my assessment carries significant weight in the recommendation process. She pulled a folder from her briefcase that had somehow remained dry throughout the night's events. I've been reviewing sustainability initiatives throughout the region as part of my assessment. Your irrigation innovations came to my attention through an Air Force water conservation study that referenced your designs. Jackson blinked in surprise. My irrigation system is in an Air Force study. Resource efficiency is a military priority, especially at installations facing environmental challenges, Hayes explained. Westridge's water consumption has become a strategic vulnerability, particularly as climate patterns shift. That's part of why it's on the closure list. David leaned forward, connecting the dots. So you were already interested in Jackson's water conservation system before your plane conveniently went down on our property. Hayes's expression remained neutral. The engine failure was genuine, I assure you. But yes, I had planned to visit your operation during my assessment tour. Fate simply accelerated the timeline and provided a more immersive introduction than scheduled. She opened the folder, revealing technical diagrams that Jackson recognized as adaptations of his irrigation designs. What you've created. Here is exactly the kind of innovation the Military Installation Resilience Program was established to identify and develop. Systems that can help military bases adapt to changing environmental conditions while supporting surrounding communities. For the first time since the flood began, Jackson felt a stirring of hope. You're saying my irrigation system could help save Westridge from closure. I'm saying it could be a key factor, Hayes corrected carefully. The Department of Defense is allocating significant funding to bases that demonstrate viable sustainability, partnerships with their host communities, installations that become resource-independent and contribute to regional resilience have moved from the closure list to the reinvestment category. David's eyes narrowed shrewdly. This is why you were flying a survey mission during a storm warning. You were looking for something to justify keeping Westridge open. I was gathering comprehensive data for my assessment, Hayes replied diplomatically, but essentially yes. Westridge has strategic value that's being offset by resource vulnerabilities. Find solutions to those vulnerabilities, and the strategic value again becomes predominant. Jackson processed this information. His engineer's min-dawn broke over Clearwater Valley with eerie stillness after the night's chaos. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Fields turned to shallow lakes, roads rendered impassable, and debris scattered across once familiar terrain. The community center, now serving as an emergency shelter, buzzed with activity as displaced families huddled around tables with steaming coffee cups, exchanging stories of narrow escapes and uncertain futures. Jackson Foster stood by the large windows, surveying the damage visible from their elevated position. The valley basin, where generations of farmers had worked the soil, now resembled a vast, muddy lake, dotted with the partially submerged outbuildings and equipment no one had. Time to save. According to emergency services, nearly 60% of Clearwater Valley's agricultural land was currently underwater. "How's the Ramirez family?" David asked, joining his son at the window. "Baby and mother are both stable," Jackson replied. "They airlifted them to Westridge's medical facility an hour ago. Best equipped place within 50 miles with the main roads cut off." They stood in silence for a moment, processing the overnight transformation of their community. "Our place?" Jackson finally asked, though he already suspected the answer. "North fields are flooded completely," David confirmed. "The house is still above water, but the equipment shed took on about 2 feet. Your workshop, too." Jackson nodded, absorbing this latest blow with the stoic resignation that farmers develop over years of battling unpredictable forces. "What about your experimental irrigation system components?" "Managed to save the core electronic modules before evacuation." David patted his jacket pocket, where he'd stored the thumb drives containing Jackson's designs. "Everything else is replaceable." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. After years of desperate drought, they now faced destruction from too much water arriving too quickly. Mother Nature's cruel reminder that humanity's control over the elements was merely an illusion. Their conversation was interrupted by a purposeful presence approaching from behind. Colonel Alexandra Hayes, now back in a fresh military uniform, that someone had delivered from the base, moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. Despite having been awake all night coordinating rescue efforts, she appeared remarkably composed. "Mr. Foster," she addressed David formally, then nodded to his son. "Jackson, do you have a moment?" Father and son exchanged glances before following Hayes to a quieter corner of the community center where a makeshift command post had been established. Maps of Clearwater Valley were spread across tables, marked with evacuation zones, resource deployments, and damage assessments. Military and civilian emergency personnel worked side by side, coordinating the valley's most significant disaster response in decades. "The situation remains critical but stabilizing," Hayes informed them, pointing to the most recent satellite imagery of the valley. "We've accounted for all residents, and preliminary engineering assessments indicate the flooding will begin receding within 36 to 48 hours, barring additional rainfall." "What about Canyon Creek Dam?" Jackson asked. "Complete failure?" Hayes nodded grimly. "Catastrophic structural collapse. The spillways were inadequate for the water volume, and years of deferred maintenance left the primary structure vulnerable, nearly identical to 3 other small dams in the region." "Maintenance costs money," David observed quietly. "Most of these agricultural infrastructure projects have seen their budgets slashed repeatedly over the last decade." "A false economy," Hayes agreed with surprising candor for a military officer. "The recovery and reconstruction costs will far exceed what proper maintenance would have required." She gestured to a chair, inviting them to sit. "However, I didn't ask to speak with you about the dam failure. There's another matter I'd like to discuss, one that may be significant for Clearwater Valley's future." Jackson noticed a shift in her demeanor. She was transitioning from emergency commander to something else, though her professional bearing remained unchanged. "My presence in Clearwater Valley yesterday wasn't entirely coincidental," Hayes began, confirming David's earlier suspicion. "I'm the Operational Assessment Director for the Military Installation Resilience Program, examining Westridge Air Base's long-term viability." "You're the one who decides if Westridge closes," Jackson stated flatly. "Not personally, no. The final decision involves multiple federal agencies and congressional approval," Hayes clarified. "But my assessment carries significant weight in the recommendation process." She pulled a folder from her briefcase that had somehow remained dry throughout the night's events. "I've been reviewing sustainability initiatives throughout the region as part of my assessment. Your irrigation innovations came to my attention through an Air Force water conservation study that referenced your designs." Jackson blinked in surprise. "My irrigation system is in an Air Force study?" "Resource efficiency is a military priority, especially at installations facing environmental challenges," Hayes explained. "Westridge's water consumption has become a strategic vulnerability, particularly as climate patterns shift. That's part of why it's on the closure list." David leaned forward, connecting the dots. "So, you were already interested in Jackson's water conservation system before your plane conveniently went down on our property?" Hayes's expression remained neutral. "The engine failure was genuine, I assure you. But yes, I had planned to visit your operation during my assessment tour. Fate simply accelerated the timeline and provided a more immersive introduction than scheduled." She opened the folder, revealing technical diagrams that Jackson recognized as adaptations of his irrigation designs. "What you've created here is exactly the kind of innovation the Military Installation Resilience Program was established to identify and develop. Systems that can help military bases adapt to changing environmental conditions while supporting surrounding communities. For the first time since the flood began, Jackson felt a stirring of hope. "You're saying my irrigation system could help save Westridge from closure?" "I'm saying it could be a key factor," Hayes corrected carefully. "The Department of Defense is allocating significant funding to bases that demonstrate viable sustainability partnerships with their host communities. Installations that become resource-independent and contribute to regional resilience have moved from the closure list to the reinvestment category." David's eyes narrowed shrewdly. "This is why you were flying a survey mission during a storm. Warning, you were looking for something to justify keeping Westridge open." "I was gathering comprehensive data for my assessment," Hayes replied diplomatically. "But essentially, yes. Westridge has strategic value that's being offset by resource vulnerabilities. Find solutions to those vulnerabilities, and the strategic value, again, becomes predominant." Jackson processed this information, his engineer's mind already calculating possibilities. "So theoretically, if Westridge implemented water conservation systems based on my designs, reducing their resource footprint while maintaining operational capacity, then the primary argument for closure would be substantially weakened," Hayes finished for him, "particularly if those same systems could be expanded to support agricultural resilience in the surrounding community. The implication hung in the air between them, a potential lifeline not just for the Foster farm, but for the entire Clearwater Valley. If Westridge remained open with expanded operations, the economic foundation of the community would stabilize. If military funding supported the implementation of advanced irrigation systems throughout the valley, the farms might finally have a chance against the corporate agricultural operations threatening to absorb them. "Why are you telling us this now?" David asked, his natural caution asserting itself. "In the middle of a flood emergency?" Hayes regarded him steadily. "Because crises reveal truths that remain hidden during normal times, Mr. Foster. Last night, I watched your son risk his life to save a family he barely knew. I saw a community mobilize with remarkable efficiency despite limited resources. Most importantly, I witnessed firsthand how civilian and military assets could integrate seamlessly when necessary." She closed the folder deliberately. Those observations confirm what the data had already suggested, that Westridge and Clearwater Valley function best as partners rather than separate entities. My preliminary recommendation will reflect that finding. Before either Foster could respond, a National Guard officer approached, requiring Hayes's immediate attention for the ongoing emergency operations. She excused herself, but paused before leaving. "Jackson, when things stabilize, I'd like you to come to Westridge to discuss your irrigation system with our engineering team. Bring your complete designs and implementation requirements." She handed him a military business card with her direct contact information. "This could be significant for your farm's future and the valley's." As Hayes returned to her duties, father and son sat in stunned silence, processing the unexpected development amid the chaos of the emergency shelter. "Do you believe her?" Jackson finally asked his father. David considered the question carefully. Military folks tend to speak more directly than politicians or corporate types. If she says your irrigation system could help save Westridge, I'm inclined to think she means exactly that. But is it really possible? My cobbled-together system, built from spare parts and desperation? Don't underestimate what you've created, David replied firmly. Your grandfather used to say that the most powerful innovations come from necessity, not luxury. You've been solving problems corporate engineers never have to face with a fraction of their resources. Jackson stared at Hayes's business card, turning it over in his fingers. Even if this works, even if Westridge stays open and implements water conservation based on my system, Agricor won't just disappear. They'll still be trying to consume every family farm in the valley. One battle at a time, son, David counseled. First, we rebuild from the flood. Then we see what this military partnership might offer. The community center's doors opened, admitting another group of mud-covered residents who had returned from checking their properties. The Wilsons, whose farm bordered Canyon Creek, looked shell-shocked as volunteers guided them toward hot food and dry clothes. Jackson pocketed Hayes's card and stood. "You're right. The future can wait. Right now, our neighbors need help." For the next 3 days, the foster men worked alongside their community, helping families salvage what they could from flooded homes and businesses. The military presence from Westridge remained constant, Black Hawk helicopters delivering supplies to isolated properties, engineering teams assessing structural damage, medical personnel providing care at the emergency shelter. Colonel Hayes was omnipresent, coordinating military assets with local emergency services with remarkable efficiency. Jackson occasionally caught her watching him as he organized volunteer teams and improvised solutions to immediate problems. The same assessing gaze she'd shown when reviewing his irrigation designs. By the 4th day, the floodwaters had receded enough for most residents to return home and begin the grueling process of cleanup and recovery. The foster farm had fared better than many. Their house remained untouched, though several outbuildings needed extensive repairs. Most importantly, Jackson's workshop, while water-damaged, had protected the majority of his irrigation prototypes and equipment. As he surveyed the mud-caked components spread across the workshop floor, determining what could be salvaged, a military vehicle pulled up the driveway. Colonel Hayes emerged, accompanied by a man in civilian clothes, whose bearing nonetheless marked him as military. "Jackson," Hayes greeted him as he met them outside. "This is Dr. Elliot Davidson, head of Westridge's Sustainability Engineering Division. He's quite interested in your irrigation system." Dr. Davidson stepped forward, extending his hand. "Colonel, Hayes has spoken highly of your innovations, Mr. Foster. I'd very much like to see them firsthand, if possible." Jackson gestured to the mud-covered landscape around them. "As you can see, we're not exactly operational at the moment. Most of my demonstration setup is currently buried in silt." "Actually," Davidson replied, "that makes this the perfect time to evaluate. Any system that can be rebuilt after this level of inundation and still function effectively would demonstrate exactly the kind of resilience we're looking for." Hayes nodded agreement. "The flooding has created an unexpected test scenario, Jackson. Military installations worldwide face increasing environmental volatility. Systems that can recover quickly from extreme events are particularly valuable." Jackson considered this perspective. "I suppose that's true. Most of my components are designed to be easily replaceable with locally available materials, precisely because we can't afford specialized parts that might take weeks to deliver." "Exactly the approach we need," Davidson confirmed enthusiastically. "Military operations require systems that can be maintained in the field with limited supply chains." For the next 2 hours, Jackson guided Hayes and Davidson through his workshop, explaining his water conservation designs and the principles behind them. Despite the flood damage, enough remained intact for Davidson to grasp the ingenuity of the approach. "You've essentially created precision drip irrigation that can be assembled from standardized components, monitored wirelessly, and adjusted based on real-time soil conditions," Davidson summarized, making notes on a tablet. "And it requires approximately 40% less water than conventional systems." 42% in our field tests, Jackson corrected, though we haven't had an opportunity to implement the full system across all our acreage due to capital constraints. Hayes, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "What would full implementation require in terms of resources?" Jackson hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. For our farm alone, about $175,000 in materials, plus the labor costs we'd handle ourselves. For the entire valley's agricultural operations, probably close to $3 million. Instead of appearing shocked by these figures, Hayes and Davidson exchanged a meaningful glance. "That's well within the parameters we discussed," Davidson noted. "Agreed," Hayes replied. "Especially considering the projected water savings over the 5-year assessment period." Jackson looked between them, suddenly realizing they were discussing actual funding possibilities rather than theoretical scenarios. "Wait, are you suggesting the military might finance irrigation systems for civilian farms?" "Not directly," Hayes clarified. "But the Military Installation Resilience Program includes provisions for community partnership projects that enhance regional sustainability, particularly when those projects directly support military resource management objectives." Davidson nodded. "Westridge draws from the same watershed as Clearwater Valley's farms. If agricultural operations reduce their water consumption by 40%, the base's water security improves proportionally. That's exactly the kind of symbiotic relationship the program was designed to foster." Jackson struggled to process the implications. After years of fighting a losing battle against drought and corporate agriculture, could the solution really come from such an unexpected source? "There's more," Hayes added. "The program also includes educational components. We'd want to establish a training center where your methods could be taught to other farmers and military engineers. Potentially create a model that could be replicated at installations facing similar challenges." "A training center?" Jackson repeated. "Here in Clearwater Valley?" "Ideally, yes," Davidson confirmed. "With you as the lead instructor if you're amenable. Your practical experience combined with our resources could create something quite remarkable." The conversation was interrupted by David's arrival. He'd been in town helping coordinate supply distribution and returned to find military personnel once again at their farm. After brief introductions, Hayes summarized what they'd been discussing. David listened silently, his expression revealing nothing until she finished. "So let me understand this correctly," he said finally. "You're proposing a partnership where my son's irrigation system would be implemented across Westridge Air Base and potentially throughout Clearwater Valley, with military funding supporting the infrastructure development. In exchange, Jackson would help establish and run a training program to share these methods with others." "That's the essence, yes," Hayes confirmed. "Though there would be formal agreements and specific performance metrics to satisfy federal requirements." David looked to his son. "And what are your thoughts, Jackson?" Jackson ran a hand through his hair, still coming to terms with how rapidly events were developing. "It sounds almost too good to be true. After fighting so hard just to keep our farm operational, to suddenly have the resources to implement these systems valley-wide." "There would be challenges," Davidson cautioned. "Federal partnerships come with bureaucratic complexities, and we'd need to demonstrate measurable results to maintain funding. But the potential benefits far outweigh those challenges," Hayes added. "Not just for Westridge and your farm, but for the entire community." David studied Colonel Hayes with the shrewd assessment of a man who had negotiated with powerful entities throughout his farming career. "And this partnership would effectively secure Westridge's future? No more closure threats?" Hayes chose her words carefully. "I can't make absolute guarantees about government decisions, but I can tell you that bases demonstrating successful implementation of resilience partnerships have consistently moved from closure lists to expansion categories. The data is quite clear on that point. A military helicopter passed overhead likely continuing flood recovery operations. Its presence underscored the outsized role Westridge played in the region, not just economically, but in moments of crisis when military resources became literal lifelines. "I'd like to see this in writing," David said finally. "Detailed proposals, timelines, commitments." "Of course," Hayes agreed. "Dr. Davidson and I will prepare comprehensive documentation for your review. We can reconvene when you've had time to consider everything thoroughly." As they prepared to leave, Hayes pulled Jackson aside briefly. "One more thing you should know. Agricor Industries has submitted a proposal to provide contracted agricultural services to Westridge if the base remains open. They're positioning themselves as the only operation with sufficient scale to meet military needs." Jackson's expression darkened. "They never miss an opportunity, do they?" "No," Hayes agreed. "But their proposal depends on the assumption that small farms can't coordinate effectively to meet our requirements. Your valley-wide irrigation system could directly challenge that narrative." "Giving family farms a fighting chance," Jackson mused. "Precisely," Hayes confirmed. "This isn't just about water conservation, Jackson. It's about whether communities like Clearwater Valley have a future in the changing agricultural landscape." After the military representatives departed, Jackson and David sat on their porch, surveying the mud-covered fields that would require weeks of work before becoming productive again. "What do you think, Dad?" Jackson finally asked. "Is this real, or are we clutching at false hope?" David considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Colonel Hayes strikes me as someone who means exactly what she says, and the military does have resources we couldn't access otherwise. But partnering with Westridge, becoming dependent on federal funding and military priorities, as opposed to watching Agricor systematically dismantle our community farm by farm," David countered. "Sometimes survival requires new alliances." Jackson nodded slowly. "I never imagined my makeshift irrigation system could become something this significant." "Your grandfather would say you were seeing only the beginning of its potential," David replied. "He always believed innovation happened at the edges, not the center. The big corporations are too comfortable to see what's possible when necessity drives creativity." They sat in companionable silence, watching as neighbors in the distance worked to clear debris from their properties. Throughout the valley, the slow process of recovery was taking shape, families refusing to surrender despite overwhelming challenges. "Whatever we decide," Jackson said finally, "it needs to benefit everyone in the valley, not just our farm." David smiled, paternal pride evident. "That's exactly why Colonel Hayes sees you as the right partner for this project. You understand what she's really trying to build here." "What's that?" "Resilience," David answered simply. "Not just water systems or military bases, but communities that can adapt and survive in changing conditions. That's what you've been creating all along, even if you didn't recognize it." The next morning, Jackson rose before dawn as usual, but instead of immediately beginning farm chores, he spent an hour refining his irrigation designs. With potential military funding on the horizon, he could finally incorporate improvements. He'd been conceptualizing for years, but lacked resources to implement. He was so absorbed in his work that he almost missed the sound of a vehicle approaching. Looking up, he was surprised to see not a military vehicle, but Rebecca Carlson's sleek Agricor SUV navigating the still muddy driveway. Stepping outside to meet her, Jackson noticed immediately that her typical corporate polish had been replaced by a more urgent demeanor. "Mr. Foster," she greeted him with forced pleasantness. "I'm glad to find you here. We've been trying to reach several valley farmers without success. Communication systems are still somewhat unreliable after the flooding. Most people are focused on cleanup rather than answering phones," Jackson replied neutrally. "What brings Agricor out so early?" Carlson straightened, shifting into what Jackson recognized as her acquisition pitch posture. In light of the recent catastrophic flooding, Agricor is extending special emergency purchase offers to affected properties. We understand many farms face overwhelming recovery costs without adequate insurance coverage. How considerate, Jackson remarked. Dryly, either missing or ignoring his sarcasm, Carlson continued, "For the Foster operation specifically, we're prepared to increase our previous offer by 35%, with immediate payment processing to provide liquidity during your recovery efforts." She extended a folder containing what Jackson assumed would be purchase documents. "Additionally, we're still very interested in bringing you on board as an irrigation consultant. Your expertise would be invaluable to our sustainability division." Jackson didn't take the folder. "Our farm isn't for sale, Ms. Carlson. Not before the flood, and certainly not now." Her pleasant expression faltered slightly. "Mr. Foster, I admire your determination, but you must recognize the economic realities. The flood damage alone will cost tens of thousands to address, and that's before considering your existing financial challenges. Agricor has the resources to restore this land properly." "We're exploring alternative partnerships," Jackson replied, thinking of his conversation with Colonel Hayes. "Ones that don't involve selling our family legacy." Something in his tone must have alerted Carlson. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Would these partnerships involve Westridge Air Base by any chance?" Jackson kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he was surprised by her awareness. "Why would you ask that?" "Information travels quickly, Mr. Foster, even during disasters, perhaps especially during disasters." She recalibrated her approach. "If you're considering some arrangement with the military, I should caution you about the uncertainties of government funding. Priorities change with administrations. Budgets get cut. Programs that seem promising often evaporate when political winds shift. Unlike corporate promises, which are always kept," Jackson countered, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "How many families has Agricor made commitments to during acquisitions that were later restructured once the contracts were signed?" Carlson's pleasant facade hardened. "I'm simply suggesting you consider all factors before declining a guaranteed offer in favor of speculative military projects, particularly when that military installation remains on a closure list." "I appreciate your concern for our welfare," Jackson replied with deliberate formality. "Rest assured, we'll make decisions based on what's best for our farm and community." "Your community?" Carlson repeated, a note of condescension entering her voice. "Mr. Foster, while community sentiment is admirable, it doesn't pay recovery costs or bank loans. Agricor represents the future of sustainable agriculture at scale. Fighting that future only postpones the inevitable while increasing the financial pain for everyone involved." David appeared from the barn, having overheard the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, moving to stand beside his son. "No problem at all," Carlson replied smoothly, shifting back to her professional demeanor. "I was just leaving some information about Agricor's disaster response purchasing program. Given the circumstances, we felt it was important to reach out promptly." She handed the folder to David, who accepted it with non-committal politeness. "We'll review your offer, Ms. Carlson. I hope you will," she replied. "The terms are time-sensitive given the fluid situation." With a final, meaningful glance at Jackson, she returned to her vehicle. As the Agricor SUV disappeared down their driveway, David opened the folder and whistled softly at the figure on the top page. "They're getting nervous," he observed. "This is substantially more than their previous offer." "They know about our discussions with Colonel Hayes," Jackson replied. "Or at least, they suspect something." David nodded thoughtfully. Agricor didn't become dominant by being oblivious to threats. If Westridge implements your irrigation system and supports similar installations throughout the valley, it undermines their primary advantage, access to deeper capital reserves than family farms. It's not just about our farm anymore, is it? Jackson realized. This is about two completely different visions for agriculture in the valley. Agricor's corporate consolidation versus a community of independent farms working in partnership with the base. It always was, David replied, setting the Agricor folder aside. We just didn't have a viable alternative until Colonel Hayes literally fell from the sky. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching drew their attention back to the driveway. This time, a small convoy of military and civilian trucks appeared, led by a Humvee with Colonel Hayes visible in the passenger seat. "Speak of the devil," David murmured. As the vehicles parked and personnel began unloading equipment, Hayes approached the Foster men with purposeful strides. "Hope you don't mind the early arrival," she said by way of greeting. "We have engineering teams ready to begin assessment and recovery work on valley farms, starting with properties essential to the irrigation partnership." "That was fast," Jackson remarked, surprised by the immediate mobilization. Hayes smiled slightly. "The military can move quickly when properly motivated. Dr. Davidson worked through the night, preparing the formal proposal documents you requested." She handed David a sealed envelope. "Everything's outlined there: funding parameters, implementation timelines, performance metrics, and partnership responsibilities." Jackson surveyed the busy scene as military engineers consulted tablets while surveying their property. "What exactly is happening here?" "Initial site assessments," Hayes explained. "We're mapping flood damage relative to optimal irrigation. Implementation. Similar teams are deploying to 6 other valley farms this morning, all properties strategically positioned for the first phase of the valley-wide system." David, who had been quickly scanning the documents, looked up with newfound respect. "This is comprehensive, and the funding allocations are significant. The Military Installation Resilience Program has substantial resources," Hayes confirmed, "particularly when projects align with national security priorities like water conservation in drought-prone regions with military presence." She turned to Jackson with unexpected intensity. "We just passed Agricor's representative on the road. I assume they're making disaster-opportunistic acquisition attempts." Jackson nodded, impressed by her assessment. "Increased their offer by 35%, with hints that our potential military partnership would inevitably disappoint." Hayes's expression hardened slightly. "They've submitted competing proposals to Westridge for agricultural support services, positioning themselves as the only organization with sufficient scale to meet military needs." "And you disagree?" Jackson asked. "I believe diversified local agricultural partnerships provide greater resilience than consolidated corporate suppliers," Hayes stated firmly. "My assessment will reflect that finding." She gestured toward the engineers working efficiently across their property. "This isn't just about saving Westridge or individual farms, Jackson. It's about demonstrating a model for military-community cooperation that could be replicated nationwide. If successful, what begins in Clearwater Valley could influence agricultural policy and practice at dozens of installations facing similar challenges." The scale of what Hayes was proposing suddenly crystallized for Jackson, far beyond saving his family's farm or even preserving Clearwater Valley's agricultural community. She was designing a new relationship between military installations and their host communities, one where resources flowed in both directions for mutual benefit. "Why us?" he asked finally. "Why not start with a more established farming region with better resources?" Hayes considered her answer carefully. "Because innovation rarely comes from comfort. It emerges from necessity, from people solving real problems with limited resources, just as your irrigation system did." She looked out over the flood-damaged fields with a strategic assessment that probably mirrored how she viewed military challenges. Clearwater Valley has everything we need for a proof of concept: environmental pressure, committed local farmers with innovative approaches, and a military installation whose future depends on resource resilience. If we can make it work here, we can make it work anywhere. One of the engineers approached, requesting Hayes' input on a technical question. She excused herself, leaving Jackson and David to process everything that was happening with remarkable speed. "You realize what this means?" David said quietly. "If this partnership succeeds, it doesn't just save our farm. It creates a completely different future for Clearwater Valley than the one AgriCorps has been planning." Jackson nodded, watching as military and civilian personnel worked together across their property, already beginning the process of transforming disaster into opportunity. "I think that's exactly what Colonel Hayes intends," he replied. "The question is whether we're ready to help her build it." The answer, of course, was waiting in the mud-covered fields around them, where generations of Fosters had adapted, innovated, and persevered through challenges that would have defeated less determined souls. This was simply the next evolution of that legacy. Jackson turned toward his workshop, where his irrigation designs awaited refinement. "Let's get to work, Dad. We've got a valley to rebuild." "Probably," David acknowledged, "but that doesn't mean they'll succeed. Sometimes integrity becomes its own form of power, especially when backed by demonstrable results." He gestured toward the newly installed irrigation system components gleaming in the setting sun. "What you've built here isn't just pipes and sensors, son. It's proof that another approach is possible, that family farms can innovate solutions that corporate agriculture hasn't imagined." "Innovation without implementation doesn't change anything," Jackson replied, the weight of responsibility evident in his voice. "If Hayes gets sidelined because of her support for our project, then we'll face that challenge when it comes," David finished for him. "But anticipating defeat ensures it happens. Your grandfather used to say that farmers who plant with fear never harvest with abundance." As darkness began settling over the valley, the lights of military vehicles created a constellation of activity across the landscape, each point representing teams implementing Jackson's system on different properties. The sight was both inspiring and sobering, a physical manifestation of the alternative future they were attempting to build, in direct opposition to AgriCorps' consolidation vision. "What do you think our chances really are?" Jackson asked quietly. David considered the question with the seasoned perspective of a man who had weathered decades of agricultural challenges. Against AgriCorps' resources and political connections, if this were simply a financial battle, I'd say minimal. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "But this isn't just about money or politics anymore. It's about demonstrating a fundamentally different approach to resource management, one that strengthens communities rather than extracting from them. You think that's enough to overcome corporate influence in Washington?" "I think Colonel Hayes believes it is," David replied. "And after watching her coordinate this implementation effort, I'm not inclined to bet against her judgment." The sound of approaching footsteps brought their conversation to a pause. Hayes emerged from the gathering darkness, her uniform still crisp despite the long day of fieldwork. "Mr. Foster, Jackson," she greeted them. "The first phase monitoring network is fully operational. Initial data transmission quality exceeds specifications." "That's excellent news," David responded, though something in Hayes's manner suggested she hadn't sought them out merely to report technical success. "Is something wrong, Colonel?" Jackson asked directly. Hayes hesitated briefly, unusual for someone typically so decisive. "I've received updated orders regarding my Washington briefing. Senator Whitmore has arranged for AgriCorps executives to participate in the assessment review. Mr. Whitaker will be presenting their alternative proposal for Westridge's agricultural support directly to the committee. That was fast, Jackson observed grimly. They're not wasting any time trying to undermine our partnership. It's a predictable tactical move, Hayes replied, her professional assessment momentarily revealing her military strategic background. When faced with a disruptive innovation, established interests typically attempt to control the narrative by repositioning the discussion within familiar frameworks, in this case, traditional corporate military contracting models. What does this mean for our implementation timeline? David asked, cutting to the practical implications. Operationally, nothing changes immediately, Hayes assured them. The current deployment will continue under Dr. Davidson's supervision during my absence. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. However, I believe we should accelerate documentation of preliminary results. If I can present actual performance data rather than theoretical projections during the committee briefing, it significantly strengthens our position. How much time do we have? Jackson asked. I depart for Washington in 3 days, Hayes replied. Ideally, we need at least 72 hours of continuous system operation with comprehensive data collection across multiple properties. Jackson calculated rapidly. We'd need to complete Phase 1 implementation by tomorrow evening and initiate synchronized operation across all 7 primary properties immediately. Can it be done? Hayes asked directly. The question hung in the air between them, a challenge issued not from superior to subordinate, but from partner to partner. In Hayes's eyes, Jackson recognized something he hadn't fully appreciated before. She was trusting his assessment completely, placing her professional reputation on his technical judgment. Yes, he replied with quiet certainty. If we run continuous shifts and streamline the calibration procedures, I'll need direct access to the military engineering teams and authorization to modify the implementation protocols as needed. Hayes nodded without hesitation. You'll have whatever resources you require. Dr. Davidson will coordinate personnel assignments according to your specifications. The simple efficiency of her response, the immediate provision of requested support without bureaucratic qualification, reminded Jackson why military operations often achieved results that seemed impossible within civilian timeframes. I should warn you, he added, this accelerated implementation increases the risk of system optimization issues. Will be compressed weeks of calibration into hours. Understood and accepted, Hayes replied. Preliminary data with minor calibration, anomalies, is vastly preferable to no data at all when facing a politically orchestrated committee review. As night fully claimed the valley, the three stood in momentary silence, each contemplating the challenge ahead from their unique perspective. The military officer facing political pressure, the innovative farmer seeing his designs implemented at unprecedented scale, and the elder agriculturalist witnessing perhaps the final battle for his community's survival. We should get started immediately, Jackson finally said. I'll need to revise the implementation sequence and establish priority connections. Hayes nodded. I'll have the command tent converted to 24-hour operations and arrange for additional equipment to be delivered by morning. As they turned to descend from the ridge, David Foster spoke up. Colonel, a question if I may. Why are you pushing so hard for this particular approach? Agricorp's proposal would certainly be the safer choice politically. Hayes paused, considering her answer carefully. Mr. Foster, throughout my military career I've evaluated countless systems and strategies. The most reliable indicator of long-term success isn't initial efficiency or political palatability. It's adaptability under stress. She gestured toward the valley where their partnership was taking physical form. What your son has created isn't just an irrigation system, it's a community resilience network. Each farm becomes simultaneously independent in operation, yet interconnected in resource management. That model mirrors the most effective military organizational structures I've encountered. "And that's worth risking your career?" Jackson asked quietly. Hayes met his gaze directly. "Some principles transcend career considerations, Jackson. Creating systems that strengthen communities rather than extract from them is one of those principles, whether in military or civilian contexts." With that simple but profound statement of purpose, Hayes began walking toward the command center, already calling instructions to her team on her radio. David watched her go with newfound respect. "You know, son, in all my years of dealing with government officials, I've never met one quite like Colonel Hayes." "No," Jackson agreed thoughtfully. "I don't think many people have." As they followed Hayes down the hillside, Jackson felt a renewed sense of determination, replacing his earlier uncertainty. Against corporate resources and political influence, they had something potentially more powerful, an innovative system that actually worked, implemented by people committed to values beyond profit margins. Whether that would be enough to overcome Agricorp's Washington connections remained to be seen. But as military spotlights illuminated their path forward, Jackson found himself believing that Hayes's approach, prioritizing mission effectiveness over political calculation, might indeed prove the stronger position. After all, as his grandfather had often reminded him, truth had a permanence that politics and profit motives could never match. And the truth they were now racing to document in soil moisture readings and water conservation metrics might ultimately prove more persuasive than all of Agricorp's carefully crafted narratives and political connections. With renewed purpose, Jackson quickened his pace. They had 3 days to prove what was possible when military precision met agricultural innovation, 3 days to create the data that might determine not just Westridge's future, but the survival of every family farm in Clearwater Valley. The full, ornate committee room in the Russell Senate office building hummed with anticipation as Colonel Alexandra Hayes stood at perfect attention, her dress uniform immaculate, her posture betraying none of the fatigue from 3 days of continuous travel and preparation. The polished mahogany table before her held a single folder containing the data that might determine the future of Clearwater Valley. The room fell silent, each farmer contemplating the difficult reality of their situation. Even with promising performance data and Hayes's compelling presentation, corporate resources and political influence remained powerful forces against their community partnership. David looked around the table, recognizing the uncertainty in expressions of people he'd known his entire life. These weren't just neighbors, but multi-generational farming families whose connections ran as deep as the soil they worked. People who had always faced challenges together, supporting one another through droughts, market downturns, and natural disasters. "I understand the pressures we're all facing," he said finally. "And I would never presume to tell any family what decision they should make about their land and livelihood." He unfolded a new document, placing it at the center of the table. "That's why we've prepared this." Jackson leaned forward, surprised to see a legal agreement he hadn't been aware his father was developing. "The Clearwater Valley Agricultural Preservation Trust," David explained, "a legally binding mutual support framework that would allow us to pool resources to assist families facing immediate financial crises while maintaining the integrity of our land ownership and the irrigation network." He outlined the structure, a community-based financial support system that would provide emergency funding to member farms while securing commitments to the partnership approach. Contributions would be proportional to each farm's resources, with repayment terms flexible enough to accommodate recovery timelines. "For families like the Pattersons," David continued, "this would provide immediate liquidity to address critical needs without surrendering their property to corporate acquisition. For more stable operations, it creates a resilience buffer against future challenges. The farmers studied the proposal with cautious interest, moving from initial skepticism toward guarded hope as they recognized the practical protections it offered against Agricorp's divide-and-conquer strategy. This isn't charity, David emphasized, understanding the pride that ran through farming communities. It's mutual insurance, recognizing that our collective strength provides security none of us can achieve individually. The same principle underlying the irrigation network itself. Henderson was the first to respond. "I've got equipment sitting idle since we downsized last year. Patterson could use it until he replaces what was lost, worth more to him working than to me collecting dust." Wilson nodded. "We harvested our winter storage before the floods hit. Can spare supplies for families who lost theirs." One by one, farmers began identifying resources they could contribute: equipment, stored supplies, labor, technical expertise. The conversation transformed from uncertainty about resisting Agricorp to practical planning for community self-support. Jackson watched with growing amazement as his father's simple document catalyzed exactly the collective response they needed, not through emotional appeals to solidarity, but through pragmatic mechanisms that acknowledged financial realities, while creating viable alternatives to corporate dependency. As the meeting progressed, Jackson's phone buzzed with an incoming message from Dr. Davidson. System performance data exceeding projections. 51% water efficiency improvement as calibration optimizations take effect. He shared the update with the gathered farmers, whose expressions brightened at this tangible evidence that their partnership was delivering measurable results, even beyond what Hayes had presented to the committee. "Every percentage point of improvement strengthens our position," David noted, both with the military committee and against Agricorp's projections. The meeting continued well into evening, transforming from crisis response to strategic planning as the community rediscovered its collective strength. By the time farmers began departing, 23 signatures adorned the Preservation Trust Agreement, representing over 80% of Clearwater Valley's agricultural land, a unified front that would significantly complicate Agricorp's acquisition strategy. After the last neighbor had left, Jackson helped his father clear the dining table of maps and documents. "When did you develop the Preservation Trust concept?" he asked, still impressed by how effectively it had addressed their most vulnerable point. David smiled slightly. "Been working on it since Hayes first mentioned the possibility of Agricorp increasing pressure during the committee review. Henderson's wife, Laura, helped with the legal framework. Her experience as a former bank loan officer proved invaluable." "You didn't mention it to me," Jackson observed, not accusingly, but with curiosity. "You were focused on the technical implementation, as you should have been," David replied, "and I needed to contribute something beyond moral support to this partnership. Old farmers still have a few useful skills, even in the age of digital irrigation systems." Jackson shook his head in appreciation of his father's understated wisdom. "They'll still come with offers designed to break through our defenses. Agricorp has resources to make propositions that could test even the Preservation Trust's capacity." "Undoubtedly," David agreed. "But they're accustomed to dealing with isolated farmers, making individual decisions under financial pressure. They're not prepared for a community acting as a coordinated entity with mutual support mechanisms." He collected the signed preservation trust agreements, storing them carefully in the family's fireproof document safe. Corporate strategies are designed for fragmented opposition. When communities maintain cohesion, the dynamics shift dramatically. The night passed, with both Fosters working late, David coordinating with Henderson to arrange equipment transfers to the Patterson farm, Jackson fine-tuning the irrigation monitoring system to capture optimal performance metrics for Hayes's final Committee presentation. Near midnight, Jackson stepped outside to clear his head, looking up at stars brilliantly visible in the clear post-flood sky. The valley spread before him, now marked by the subtle indicators of their irrigation network, monitoring stations catching occasional moonlight, distribution hubs positioned at strategic intervals across neighboring properties. More than the physical components, however, what struck him was the invisible connectivity now linking these farms, not just through water management technology, but through renewed community bonds that had been slowly eroding under years of economic pressure and corporate encroachment. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from Hayes, committee members requesting additional technical briefing before tomorrow's deliberation. 3 senators expressing specific interest in distributed resilience aspects of network design, sending secure link for live system demonstration. Jackson felt a surge of cautious optimism. Committee members seeking additional information beyond the formal presentation suggested genuine interest rather than merely following Whitmore's political directive. He immediately messaged Dr. Davidson to prepare the monitoring system for a live demonstration, then returned inside to find his father still awake, reviewing financial projections for the Preservation Trust. Hayes says committee members are requesting more technical information, Jackson reported. They want a live demonstration of the system tomorrow morning before their final deliberation. David looked up from his papers, hope cautiously entering. His expression, "That's significant. They wouldn't invest additional time if they'd already decided to dismiss our approach. Or Whitmore is giving them the opportunity to find technical flaws that would justify rejecting it," Jackson countered, still wary of political machinations. "Perhaps," David acknowledged. "But Hayes wouldn't have guided us this far if she didn't. Believe the system's performance could withstand technical scrutiny." The following morning arrived with unexpected developments from multiple directions. Jackson woke to find military vehicles once again coming up their driveway, this time bringing additional monitoring equipment for the live demonstration to the committee. As technicians established secure connections to Washington, Jackson's phone rang with a call from Miguel Ramirez. "AgriCorps representatives are going door to door across the valley," Miguel reported urgently, offering on-the-spot cash payments for property purchase agreements. They've brought mobile notaries and are prepared to complete transactions immediately. They're trying to create facts on the ground before the committee decides. Jackson realized. "Has anyone accepted?" "Not among the trust signatories," Miguel confirmed. "But they're applying extreme pressure, especially to elderly farmers and those with significant flood damage. The Johnsons said Whitaker himself visited them, offering double their property's pre-flood value." "Stay with the Johnsons if you can," Jackson requested. "They're at a critical junction point for the Western distribution network. If they hold, it helps maintain system integrity." Similar reports came in throughout the morning, AgriCorps deploying its full corporate resources in a coordinated attempt to fracture the valley's unity before the committee's final deliberation. The pressure tactics were sophisticated, with offers tailored to each property's specific vulnerabilities and financial situation. Meanwhile, Dr. Davidson coordinated with Hayes in Washington, establishing the secure connection that would allow committee members to view real-time performance data directly from the operational system. Jackson validated monitoring accuracy across all connected properties, ensuring the demonstration would present the most compelling data possible. At precisely 9:30 a.m. Washington time, the secure link activated. Jackson could hear Hayes's voice, introducing the demonstration to committee members, though the connection allowed only one-way video showing the Clearwater Valley Monitoring Center to the committee. "Senators, you're now viewing the live operational control center for the Foster Irrigation Network," Hayes explained. Mr. Foster will guide us through the current performance metrics and demonstrate the system's adaptive capabilities. For the next 45 minutes, Jackson provided a comprehensive technical briefing, showing how the system monitored soil conditions across multiple properties, adjusted water delivery in real time based on changing requirements, and maintained operational resilience despite intentionally simulated disruptions. The senators asked detailed questions that revealed genuine technical engagement rather than political posturing. Even more encouraging, their inquiries focused particularly on the distributed resilience aspects that distinguished their approach from Agricorp's centralized model. As the demonstration concluded, Hayes returned to the frame, addressing the committee with quiet confidence. Senators, what you've witnessed represents a fundamental shift in how we approach resource management for military installations. The Foster Network demonstrates that partnership with diverse local agricultural operations creates greater resilience than dependency on single-source corporate providers. She paused, allowing her next point to carry appropriate weight. More importantly, this approach aligns with the core mission of the Military Installation Resilience Program, strengthening both bases and their host communities to create integrated security rather than isolated enclaves. The secure connection ended, leaving the team in Clearwater Valley without immediate feedback on the committee's reaction. Jackson turned to Dr. Davidson, who had been monitoring system performance throughout the demonstration. "How did it look from the technical side?" he asked. "Flawless," Davidson confirmed with evident satisfaction. "The optimization adjustments we implemented overnight pushed efficiency metrics to 53% improvement over baseline, well beyond anything Agricorp claimed in their presentation." Before they could discuss further, Jackson's phone rang with a call from David, who had been coordinating the community response to Agricorp's acquisition blitz. "You need to get to the Johnson farm immediately," his father said without preamble. "Whitaker is there with their corporate legal team, applying maximum pressure. The Johnsons are wavering despite the trust agreement." Jackson grabbed his keys, heading for his truck with urgent purpose. The Johnson property's strategic location made it particularly valuable to Agricorp's counter-strategy. If they secured that land, it would create a significant gap in the irrigation network's western distribution. When he arrived 20 minutes later, he found an Agricorp corporate convoy already parked in the Johnsons' yard. Inside their modest farmhouse, James Whitaker sat at their kitchen table, an array of legal documents spread before the elderly couple. Miguel Ramirez stood nearby, his expression revealing the tension of the ongoing negotiation. "Ah, Mr. Foster," Whitaker greeted him with corporate cordiality. "Perfect timing. The Johnsons were just explaining how your community trust might not provide the immediate financial security our direct purchase offers." Martha Johnson, in her 70s and visibly stressed by the confrontation, looked up apologetically. "They're offering 3 times the pre-flood value, Jackson, with guaranteed lifetime occupancy rights to the farmhouse. After losing half our equipment in the flood." "I understand completely," Jackson assured her, taking a seat at the table. "Without waiting for invitation. That's precisely why the Preservation Trust was established, to provide immediate financial support while maintaining your ownership." "But the Trust has limited resources," Whitaker interjected smoothly. "Agricorp can provide certainty rather than community promises. The Johnsons deserve security after a lifetime of agricultural service." The calculated appeal to their financial vulnerability was delivered with practiced sympathy that masked its predatory nature. Jackson recognized that direct counter-arguments would only create an adversarial dynamic that Agricorp's negotiators were trained to exploit. Instead, He simply placed his phone on the table, activating the monitoring app that displayed real-time data from the irrigation network. "Mrs. Johnson, do you remember when you taught me how to prune apple trees when I was 9? He asked, seemingly changing the subject. "You said agriculture wasn't just about growing crops, but about cultivating legacies that outlast individual farmers." Martha's expression softened at the memory. "You were so determined to make perfect cuts. Spent all afternoon on a single tree. Your orchard irrigation section came online yesterday," Jackson continued, showing them the monitoring screen displaying data specifically from their property. "It's currently showing the highest efficiency metrics in the Western Valley, 7% water reduction while maintaining optimal soil moisture for your apples." He zoomed out to show their property's position in the broader network. "The system you're helping create isn't just saving water. It's redefining how agricultural communities survive changing conditions. It's exactly the legacy you described to me all those years ago." Harold Johnson, who had been largely silent during Whitaker's presentation, leaned forward to study the real-time data from his orchard. "Those are actual current readings, not projections." "Live data," Jackson confirmed. "Your soil monitoring stations are transmitting continuously to the central system. The network has already mapped the unique requirements of your different apple varieties and adjusts delivery accordingly." Whitaker attempted to redirect the conversation. "While these technical achievements are admirable, they don't address the fundamental financial security AgriCore's offer provides, especially with no guarantee that the military partnership will receive final approval." Jackson's phone buzzed with an incoming message. When he checked the notification, he couldn't suppress a smile. "Actually," he said quietly, "I believe that situation has just changed." He opened the message, a forwarded communication from Hayes to all implementation team members. "Committee vote, 7-2 in favor of Foster Network approach. Senator Whitmore. Dissenting but overruled by majority. Full implementation, funding approved. Formal announcement at 1400 hours. Jackson placed the phone on the table where everyone could read the message. "The Senate committee has just voted overwhelmingly to support our partnership approach over AgriCore's proposal. Full implementation funding has been approved." The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly. Martha Johnson's expression shifted from stressed uncertainty to vindicated hope, while her husband straightened in his chair with renewed confidence. Whitaker's corporate poise faltered momentarily before recovering. "Committee recommendations aren't final appropriations. The process involves multiple approvals that could take months, during which many variables might change." He gestured toward the purchase documents. "Our offer provides immediate certainty rather than bureaucratic promises." "The Preservation Trust provides immediate support as well," Jackson countered calmly, "with the added benefit of maintaining your ownership and participation in a project that just received formal Senate committee endorsement." He turned to Harold and Martha with genuine respect. "The decision remains entirely yours, of course. The community will support whatever choice you feel is best for your family's future." The elderly couple exchanged a long look that communicated decades of shared decision-making. Finally, Harold turned to Whitaker with quiet dignity. "We appreciate AgriCore's interest in our property, Mr. Whitaker, but our land isn't just real estate. It's our heritage and our community's future. Please respect that our farm is not for sale." Whitaker's expression revealed the rare experience of corporate strategy failing against community cohesion. "I urge you to reconsider. Once our acquisition threshold reaches critical mass, property values for non-participating farms will decline significantly. This offer represents your best opportunity for maximum value." "Some values can't be measured in dollars, young man. Martha replied with the wisdom of someone who had weathered many corporate acquisition attempts over decades of farming. Now, unless you'd care to sample some apple pie before you leave, I believe our business is concluded. The dismissal, delivered with grandmotherly politeness that nonetheless allowed no further negotiation, left Whitaker with no graceful option but withdrawal. Within minutes, the Agricorps convoy was departing the Johnson farm, heading toward what would likely be equally unsuccessful attempts at other properties. As the dust from their departure settled, Harold turned to Jackson with quiet gratitude. Perfect timing with that committee announcement. Don't think we could have held out much longer without some certainty about the partnership's future. The Fosters have always had a knack for showing up when needed most, Martha added with affection. Just like when your grandfather helped us replant after the hailstorm of '78. Miguel, who had been silently supportive throughout the confrontation, grinned broadly. Should we tell the others, or let Agricorps waste their day making offers? Nobody's going to accept now that the funding's approved. Jackson laughed. I suspect news is already spreading. Dad's probably called everyone in the trust by now. Indeed, by the time Jackson returned to the monitoring center, the mood throughout Clearwater Valley had transformed. Farmers were gathering, spontaneously sharing stories of Agricorps representatives departing in frustrated defeat as news of the committee decision spread from property to property. At exactly 2 p.m. as promised, the official announcement came through formal channels. The Military Installation Resilience Program had approved full implementation funding for the Foster Irrigation Network as the cornerstone of Westridge Air Base's sustainability strategy. More significantly, the base had been removed from the closure list and reclassified for strategic enhancement, with expanded operations planned over the coming 5 years. The monitoring center erupted in cheers as military personnel and farmers celebrated together. A partnership that had seemed improbable just weeks earlier, now officially recognized as a model for future military-community collaborations. Amid the celebration, Jackson's phone rang with an incoming call from Hayes. He stepped outside to hear her more clearly. "Congratulations, Colonel," he said immediately. "Your presentation clearly made the difference with the committee." "The data made the difference," Hayes corrected with characteristic precision. "Your system's performance spoke more persuasively than any presentation could have. What about Senator Whitmore? Will he cause problems for implementation funding?" "He's already pivoting to claim partial credit for ensuring proper oversight of innovative approaches," Hayes replied, with the faintest trace of dry amusement. Politicians excel at repositioning themselves when the prevailing winds change direction. Jackson smiled at her understated observation. "And Agricorps?" "Shifting strategy as we speak. Their Washington office is already reaching out about potential collaborative roles in the implementation process. When corporations can't defeat innovation, they attempt to associate themselves with it." The conversation shifted to implementation timelines and expansion planning, Hayes operating with the efficiency of someone accustomed to moving immediately from approval to execution without pausing for extended celebration. "When do you return to Clearwater Valley?" Jackson asked as they concluded the technical discussion. "Tomorrow morning," Hayes replied. "The formal documentation requires my personal signature. Then I'll be on the first transport back to continue direct oversight of the implementation." As they ended the call, Jackson rejoined the celebration inside, finding his father deep in conversation with Dr. Davidson about Phase 3 expansion planning for the irrigation network. "Hayes confirms it's official," Jackson announced to those nearby. "Westridge stays open with expanded operations, and our irrigation partnership is fully funded." David looked up with quiet satisfaction that went beyond the immediate victory. "Henderson just called from town. Agricorps representatives are already checking out of their hotel rooms. Apparently, Their acquisition initiative has been indefinitely suspended pending reassessment of regional strategy. The corporate speak translation was clear. Agricor had recognized defeat in Clearwater Valley. At least for now, their consolidated acquisition approach had failed against the community's unified response and Hayes's decisive leadership. As afternoon turned to evening, the impromptu celebration expanded. Farmers arrived with food and drinks, military personnel joined after completing their shifts, and the monitoring center transformed into a community gathering that symbolized the partnership they had fought to create. Jackson eventually found a quiet moment to step outside, needing brief solitude to process everything that had happened. Standing on the same ridge where he had first spotted Hayes's damaged aircraft during the storm, he surveyed the valley with new perspective. The physical landscape remained largely unchanged. Fields still recovering from flood damage, farms still facing the ongoing challenges of agricultural life. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the community's relationship with that landscape and with each other. He was still absorbing this transformation when his father joined him on the ridge. "Quite a view," David observed, gazing across the valley where implementation teams continued working despite the celebration, installing monitoring stations that glinted occasionally in the setting sun. "Hard to believe it all started with a plane crash during a storm," Jackson replied. "If Hayes hadn't gone down on our property that night, then her search would have led her here eventually anyway," David finished confidently. "Innovation. He finds its champions, son. If not through dramatic crashes, then through persistent searching. Hayes was looking for exactly what you'd created. She just found it sooner than scheduled." Jackson considered this perspective. Still, the timing seems almost deliberately orchestrated, everything falling into place exactly when needed. David smiled slightly. "Your grandfather would say there are no accidents in agriculture, only seeds planted at the right time finally coming to harvest." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.